Good afternoon, everyone. Many or most of us here are metalworkings following the traditions and techniques established in the Middle Ages. See, so not everybody has a computer, plastic building machine. But fine armor, in many ways, is the apex of hand-wrought, no, pardon me, I'm going to start over. Fine armor is in many ways the apex of hand-wrought sheet metal construction, with greatest regard for engineering, precision fit, protection, and glamour. We are very fortunate to have an exceptionally gifted curator of medieval art speak to us today about armor. Born and educated in England, Stephen Fliegel began his work at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1982, the last year of the great art historian Sherman Lee's 24-year directorship. Later directors recognized the popular armor collection needed to be culled of inauthentic pieces. Now, this collection was purchased in 1916 with funds from John L. Severance and his sister, Elizabeth, and they provided for an armor court and the armor that went in it. This armor had to be purchased in a hurry when the first deal fell through. So they had many pieces of dubious provenance. However, if you go to the Cleveland Museum of Art now, you will notice that there are quite a few pieces that were from the 1916 purchase. So, Stephen Fliegel, whose first specialty was medieval manuscripts, was asked to study armor, which he did for 2 years, to write a book, and to replace the items in the collection that had been decommissioned. Faithful Clevelanders who saw the armor collection as children continue to admire and support the numerous medieval galleries as they have developed to world-class significance under Stephen's guidance since 1982. So, Mr. Fliegel has written many books, including the wonderfully comprehensive Arms and Armor of the Cleveland Art Museum, cataloging the collection, as well as expertly covering the history and significance of armor. And I'm telling you, this is a must-read for any person interested in the metal arts. The Cleveland Museum of Art has galleries covering all the arts from classical to contemporary, Asian, African, Impressionist. The museum has just completed a $350 million building and renovation project financed by a capital campaign, with all the galleries but the beautiful armor court completely rearranged. It is definitely now a destination museum with 592,000 square feet. It gives me greatest pleasure to welcome Stephen Fliegel.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and Nadine, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I must say this is a bit of a novelty for me because normally I am not surrounded by so many living artists. In my world, I deal with artists who have been long dead, 600, 700 years. But I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank the Seattle Metals Guild for this very kind invitation. I'm having a lot of fun being here. I'm meeting a lot of artists and a lot of very kind people. And I love your city. This is a beautiful part of America. Many of us today would probably be inclined to view the subject of arms and armor as technology, perhaps skilled craftsmanship, but probably not an art form. I hope to convince you otherwise. Armor by tradition has come to serve as a symbol, a cultural icon of that historical epoch we know as the Middle Ages, that vast span of time between the fall of Rome and the cultural rebirth known as the Renaissance. Incorporated into heraldic designs, armor symbolizes rank, nobility, prestige, and honor. It was a favorite subject of painters, sculptors, printmakers, illuminators, and vase painters, extending back in time to classical antiquity. Images like this, produced by the Victorians, often form the very basis of our modern perception of chivalry and medieval knighthood. Yet the history of arms and armor is as old as civilization itself. Arms and armor-making techniques had in fact reached a very high level of sophistication well before the European Middle Ages. The reliefs on the Column of Trajan in Rome, made in AD 113 and seen here, clearly illustrate that the Romans manufactured and used protective armor. In classical mythology, the goddess Athena, the patroness of learning and the arts, was usually represented in armor with spear, shield, and helmet. From the beginning, arms and art were essential elements in the life of mankind. Because arms were literally a matter of life and death, it was essential that they were constructed with the greatest technical knowledge, care, and skill, a process that often resulted in functional beauty. Throughout history, arms and armor were associated with some of the noblest expressions of human life: bravery, loyalty, self-sacrifice, and solidarity. As such, armor and weapons, with the passage of time, would become artistic creations in their own right, intended both to embellish their owner and to provide him with status and authority. Arms and armor were very early, therefore, considered worthy of decoration and fine design. Well-crafted armor was an expression of its owner's wealth, taste, and standing in society. Consequently, it was just as important to an owner that his armor conform to the highest standards of fashion as his civilian dress. And like the costume he wore in civilian life, his armor should reflect the finest workmanship and materials that his means would allow. The emergence of European armor in all of its technical and aesthetic perfection was achieved during the 2 centuries between 1450 and 1650. At this moment, European armor reached dazzling sophistication of form and ornamentation, and as such has been referred to as both body jewelry and moving sculpture. The history of armor can essentially be divided into 2 periods: the age of mail, M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E, and we commonly today call it chainmail, but more properly it should be called just mail. It comes from the French word maille, meaning mesh or net. And the second age of armor was the age of plate, with an intervening century of transition between the age of mail and the age of plate. Mail was the predominant form of metal body defense in Europe until about 1350. It was essentially a protective textile, a garment constructed of large numbers of small interlinked rings of steel. The advantage of mail was that it was extremely flexible and therefore comfortable to wear. Each piece was constructed specifically to the shape and size of that part of the body it was intended to protect. So we have mail shirts, we have mail hoods There are male leggings, male gauntlets. The entire body could be covered in mail, and here you can see a detail from the famous Bayeux tapestry of the 11th century showing the Norman knights at the Battle of Hastings, and you can see that they're clearly clad in mail armor. Mail was expensive to make, which generally limited its use to warriors of noble birth who had the means to pay for it, or to others who could obtain it as war booty. The skill of mail making lay in the final linking of thousands of metal rings into a finished product. It has been deduced that a master craftsman needed 6 months to create a mail shirt comprising 250,000 rings. Mail makers are documented in the city of Cologne as early as 1293, and a surviving charter of the Mail Makers Guild of Cologne dates to 1391. We know very little about these early makers of mail armor. Beginning in the 15th century, however, occasional drawings and engravings portray such craftsmen at work, allowing us to extrapolate the manufacturing process, which must have continued relatively unchanged down through the centuries. It was the increasing effectiveness of the longbow, which was capable of punching through mail rings with its arrows, that exposed the deficiencies of mail armor. The solution to that problem was plate armor. First, small plates were gradually added to cover the limbs, then larger ones to protect the torso, until by the 15th century, the entire body was encased in steel, as you see here. The transition to plate armor was complete when the armorer had mastered the craft of shaping plates of steel to allow mobility at the limbs. This is what we call articulation, movement at the joints. So, for example, if you look at this, these elements for the arm, you can see that here, for example, there are a number of metal plates. No two are alike. You can have more than 200 plates comprising a full suit of plate armor. Each of these had to be hand-formed by a master craftsman so that you had complete movement, complete articulation at the elbows and the shoulders. This was the true art of producing plate armor. So as you can see, the armor plates were ingeniously pivoted to each other by means of sliding rivets, that is to say, rivets that move in slots at the sides. They were also made to overlap slightly to make them more flexible. Another feature of plate armor was its shape. Instead of making steel thicker to prevent penetration, individual plates were fashioned at angles to deflect arrows or sword thrusts. The breastplate, a steel plate for protecting the chest, for example, was made with a pronounced vertical ridge down the center for this very reason, while helmets assumed a more conical shape to deflect downward glancing blows to the top of the head. Plate armor was also made more form-fitting to provide greater comfort and mobility. The shaping of armor plates in this way anticipated streamlining and resulted in armor with sculptural definition and great beauty. A complete suit of armor was designed not only for personal protection, but also for weight distribution and comfort. So if it felt heavy or uncomfortable, they certainly couldn't function in it. They wouldn't have worn it. It was constructed of numerous individual plates of steel, and as I mentioned, sometimes numbering more than 200, of which no two were identical. Making a suit of armor was thus a tedious, labor-intensive, and time-consuming process that required the skills of a number of craftsmen. An armorer to forge the plates, a polisher to polish the plates, a finisher to assemble the plates into a suit and fit the pieces with fasteners, pads, and straps. And then finally, a decorator, usually a goldsmith or an etcher, to embellish the armor. The ultimate quality and reliability of a suit of armor rested not only on the skills of the armorer himself, but also on the hardness of the steel. Medieval metalworkers were adept at refining iron into steel and at strengthening the steel through the technical processes of quenching, tempering, and case hardening. While some armor was made from iron, steel, recognized very early to be harder and more durable than iron, was the preferred material for plate armor during the Middle Ages. The armor would begin by cutting the steel plates into the rough shape needed to form a specific armor, such as a breastplate or a helmet. He made patterns, much like those used by tailors today, in order to see the flat shape of the various pieces before the hammering process began. He would then begin to work the steel in its cold state by hammering it out until a basic shape was achieved. It appears that plates were subsequently hammered over metal formers or dies, corresponding to the final shape desired. These formers essentially functioned as anvils of varying shapes and sizes, onto which the armorer hammered the now hot metal. Large numbers of them were kept in the workshop to accommodate many types, styles, and sizes of armor elements. According to woodcut illustrations, such as Hans Borkmeyer's depiction of Maximilian I's court workshop, which you can see here, these anvils could be inserted into a hole in the armorer's workbench and changed, and they could be pulled out and changed as needed. So here you can see the workbench is littered with tools. You have a variety of anvils, and you can see finished products hanging in the back. And of course, here is the forge itself. Though no treatise on the making of armor has survived, we know much about this process from illuminated miniatures in books. The painting shown here of the Forge of Vulcan, while representing a mythological scene, actually shows an armorer's workshop. It was painted around 1630, still within the age of armor. And in the painting, we see the god of fire and his assistants. Vulcan was the god of fire. This is Vulcan here. And he and his assistants are working on a red-hot piece of metal in the forge, which is gray with dust. And another journeyman is making a suit of armor. They are suddenly interrupted when Apollo, the god of light, makes his entrance. As radiant as his appearance may be, Apollo brings Vulcan some unwelcome news. At this very moment, as we know from mythology, Vulcan's wife, Venus, was having an amorous tryst with Mars, the god of war. And I have to say, I love the expression on Vulcan's face when he gets this news. On another level, this painting is an informative document in that it was actually, as I mentioned, painted within the age of armor, and it thus provides us with an accurate depiction of an armorer's forge. However, there's one thing I question. I find it very difficult to believe they would be walking around barefoot with a red-hot piece of metal nearby. Once all the plates constituting the soon-to-be suit of armor had been forged, the pieces could be assembled on a trial basis to check the exactness of the fit. Any flaws were corrected by repeated filing and hammering until the fit was absolutely precise. After the trial fitting, the unassembled pieces would be passed to the next craftsman, the polisher. And keep in mind that armor plates, when they came out of the forge, they didn't look like this. They were black from all of the fumes within the forge, so they needed to be polished. And medieval armor was polished to look mirror bright. You could see your face in it. So when you go to museums today and you look at armor, it doesn't look mirror bright, but originally you have to imagine that it was very, very highly polished. Well, the larger armor workshops, such as those at Innsbruck, Augsburg, or Greenwich in England, employed several of these specialized craftsmen to repeatedly polish the armor. There were dedicated skills within each armor workshop. Next, the polished pieces were delivered to the finisher, or perhaps the master armorer himself for assembly. Each of the individual pieces, as many as 200, had to be attached to one another in the correct order to ensure a perfect fit and ease of movement. At this stage of the finishing work, hinges and buckles were also applied. Straps and buckles were used as fasteners to allow the wearer to get in and out of the armor. Finally, various components of the suit of armor, the helmet, interior, breastplate, and tassets, for example, were fitted with padded linings or velvet picadilles. These made the suit more comfortable to wear and prevented the plates from scratching during movement. The completed suit was inspected once again for fit and finish before the master armorer stamped his mark on it. The suit might then be subjected to yet another inspection by city examiners to ensure that it met standards of quality. At Nuremberg, for example, the final examiners stamped the city's half-eagle coat of arms on armor that was approved by city inspectors. In keeping with the new Renaissance taste emerging from Italy, German armorers began to emphasize rounded forms and surface ornamentation. Throughout the 16th century, armor styles continued to respond to changes in civilian costume, changes in men's civilian costume, and this is very important. The ever-changing whims of the patron determined how his armor should look. So, for example, in this miniature showing the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, you can see that men's fashions included these very pointed tips on their shoes. That was just fashion, nothing else. It had nothing to do with the functionality of shoes. And yet you see armor continues to follow male fashion. These pointed tips on the armor actually became ridiculously long. They kept getting longer and longer and longer. And then they reached a length of about 18 inches. So they had little pins on the side so that he could take them off to get into the saddle of the horse. He would put his feet through the stirrups, and then by means of these little pins, they were reattached once he was seated in the saddle. All driven by fashion. But you see that by the early 1510, 1520s, civilian costume is again beginning to change. Now men's shoes have a squared off toe, and you can see the corresponding reaction to armor that was being produced in the same period. So fashion was key to all of this, and you can see that sometimes men in their civilian dress wore these pleated skirts, and armor followed suit. And then we get to the 17th century. Here we have a painting of Louis XIII wearing armor, but armor was now beginning to conform to those wide pantaloons that men of that period were wearing. And they no longer needed armor for the lower legs, since they were wearing heavy riding boots. So this is a complete armor, never had elements for the lower leg. At the beginning of the 16th century, three categories of plate armor can be distinguished. The first was armor for field use, that is, armor intended for use in battle. Field armor was fairly light, averaging about 45 to 65 well-distributed pounds. It was strong and maneuverable with smooth, glancing surfaces. So there's a lot of myths about medieval armor, that it was very heavy. It wasn't. 45 to 65 pounds is really very comfortable if you consider that an American infantryman in World War II carried a backpack that weighed about 90 pounds. 45 to 65 pounds wasn't bad, plus it was distributed over the entire body. The second category of armor was a highly specialized type of armor for sporting purposes. These consisted of various forms of the joust and other sporting combats then prevalent at tournaments. Tournament armor was constructed of heavy, often reinforced plates of steel. A complete suit of tournament armor could weigh over 100 pounds. So in this category, tournament armor, we do begin to get a lot of weight to the armor, but they only needed to wear it for a very short period of time. And then the third category of plate armor consisted of armor made purely for personal embellishment. Parade armors used for ceremonial occasions. Since parade armor was not intended for use on the battlefield, it was made of thinner and often softer metal, usually lavishly decorated. Fashion was an important feature in the production of armor. Armors and their clients always strove to lift armor from mere protection of the body to extravagant statements of rank and status. So this is some of the most extravagant parade armors that were made. This wasn't intended to be functional armor. It was a kind of male costume that you would wear on special occasions. The helmet in the upper left was a gift from the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I to King Henry VIII of England, and it even has eyeglasses on it. And you can see a helmet over on the right in the form of a lion. So this is extravagant costume armor. Armor workshops like those of the Negroli family, I'm showing you some examples produced by this dynasty of armor makers. The Negroli were active in the city of Milan in Italy during the 16th century, and they produced some of the most fantastic armors ever made. And they brought the status, in my view, the status of armor really to a true art form. It was the 16th century that saw the finest achievements of armor design. With the lavish patronage of princes and nobles, the demand was set for extravagantly decorated parade armors to be worn on official occasions, at court festivals, and in official portraits. Almost all fine quality armor now received decoration. Engraving was one of the oldest and simplest techniques for decorating metal objects and was used for the embellishment of both armor and weapons. The technique involved the manual incising of lines into the surface of metal to create a pattern or an image. The artist used a sharp pointed instrument called a burin in what was a technically difficult and laborious process requiring much skill. The most common decorative technique for armor was etching, particularly from the late 15th century through the 17th centuries. In this technique, the design or its ground was bitten into the metal surface using acid. The rest of the surface that was not meant to have decoration was covered with a protective wax or varnish before it was exposed to the acid. Technically, etching steel was far easier than engraving or chiseling. It also enabled the artist to make changes or corrections while preparing the surface for the chemical process. While in some cases this decorative technique might have been executed by the armorer himself, it was usually carried out by specialized craftsmen. First, the metal surface to be decorated was covered with an acid-resistant coating such as wax, varnish, oil paint, or even tar. Next, the design was scratched into the metal surface through the protective medium, and the metal plate was then dipped into an acid bath. The acid would bite into the unprotected areas, leaving a permanent design. The coating was then removed with turpentine, and the etched design was blackened, perhaps with a mixture of lampblack and oil and gilding. The decorative pattern now stood out in contrast against the burnished steel ground. Gilding, a technique in which the metal surface is embellished with gold, had been used to decorate armor since the 13th century. The most common application method was by firing or mercury gilding, an extremely toxic process. This firing process evaporated the mercury and left the gold adhering to the metal. It was also possible to apply gold to armor in the form of leaf or foil. The gold leaf was applied to a freshly varnished surface with a paintbrush. The piece was then heated slowly to dry the varnish and to make the gold adhere. The gold leaf could then be burnished to a high luster. More rarely, armor was silvered by simply substituting silver foil for gold foil. So gilding could be applied to the entire surface of a suit of armor, but was more commonly used to highlight selected areas, such as the crests of helmets or the borders of breastplates. Gilding was commonly used in conjunction with other decorative techniques, such as engraving or etching. To tint armor by the bluing process, the metal plates were heated to an extremely high temperature, 590 degrees centigrade and above. At this temperature, oxidation occurs and the metal turns a deep shade of blue. The bluing of arms and armor, a technique used in German workshops from the 15th century onward, reached its height of fashion under the Habsburgs, particularly in the city of Augsburg. It was often combined with border etching and gilding to achieve a stunning look of luxury, as in these portraits. Gilding and bluing gave armor a certain amount of protection against rust, and both techniques were frequently used to embellish sword blades as well during the 18th century. The 16th century saw the revival of the ancient technique of embossing, also called repoussé. This technique had been used by goldsmiths throughout the Middle Ages, and with the advent of highly enriched and specialized parade armors, was gradually applied to the armor-making craft. In embossing, the pattern is first drawn onto the surface of the armor. The plate is then hammered and punched from the inside to gradually shape the desired raised design on the outer surface of the metal. In the 16th century, only the costliest of armors were embossed. The technique was usually carried out in highly specialized workshops and in a way that emulated antique armor. That is, it's a style of armor called all'antica, which is imitating the armor and the art of ancient Rome. Outstanding armor, but very expensive embossed suits, commonly enriched with gold and silver, were fashioned for the most wealthy of patrons. So this kind of armor that you're seeing here was incredibly expensive. You had to be royalty, you had to be a person of very high status to be able to afford this type of armor. The embossed decoration of the famous Hercules armor, which you can see here, of Emperor Maximilian II, for example, was carried out by Eliseus Lieberts of Antwerp in the middle of the 16th century. Other embossed armors were made for the kings of Portugal, Sweden, France, between the middle and the end of the century. Embossing was sometimes used in conjunction with other decorative techniques. An example is the lion armor, which I'm showing you here, made in Italy or France around 1550, and today preserved in the Tower of London. The suit is so named because of its embossed lion's masks, but is also decorated with gold damascening set against a black ground. It's a stunning, stunning suit of armor. Well, in the Middle Ages, the light and color of pageantry has always offered an escape from mundane reality. Tournaments were at the heart of medieval pageantry, and it is this image that remains with us today. Tournaments combined the spectacular with all the excitement of a dangerous, skillful sport and the attendant hero worship of its stars. All the great heroes of Arthurian romance were also masters of the tournament. Because of their popularity and because knights came together from far and wide to attend the great tournaments, they were a powerful force in generalizing both the standards and rituals of European chivalry. Much of today's surviving armor was made specifically for use in tournaments and resulted in some technically interesting designs. Tournaments were often popular spectacles held in either public or royal places. By the beginning of the 16th century, the most popular form of the joust was called the tilt, which was so named after the barrier which separated the two combatants. So this is the type of jousting that we generally see represented in films, but there were dozens of different equestrian forms of the joust. So the tilt was, or the barrier, which is called the tilt, was a safety feature. It simply prevented the two combatants from colliding into one another. So this kept them separate. It was a safety feature. The objective of the joust was usually to unseat your opponent, but in some forms the aim was also to break lances. Some tourney lances were in fact made in such a way that they would easily break at point of impact. So I'm showing you here a tilting armor that was made for Archduke Maximilian III. It dates to the 1540s, and you can see that large reinforced plate on the left shoulder. That is for protection because they passed each other left shoulder to left shoulder. This was usually the point of impact for your opponent's lance, so they had extra reinforcement in this location. And as I mentioned, the lances were often designed to snap. For them, it must have been like fireworks going off, but it was very exciting when you could unseat your opponent and at the same time snap lances. Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of much of Central Europe, as well as the Low Countries, surpassed every other monarch in the extravagance of his designs. Among the many forms of the joust which he devised was a combat called the Steckzeug, in which blunted lances were used. And here you can see the type of armor that was devised for Maximilian's use and the type of blunted lance tip that was used in that particular joust. In the Steckzeug, helmets and shields were bolted onto the actual armor. So if you are the kind of person that gets claustrophobic, you would not want to be in this armor because you could not get out of it. You could not get into it yourself. You could not get out of it. The helmet was bolted directly onto the harness itself. They had spanners, and once you were in it, you were encased. You were trapped. Well, these sporting combats, as I mentioned, necessitated the development of special armor like this frog-mouthed helm, which was made for Maximilian in 1495 by Conrad Pohler of Nuremberg. The armor workshops of Nuremberg specialized in the making of this distinctive jousting helmet. In an actual joust, the combatant leaned forward as they approached each other so that they could see each other through the sights. Right here. Keep in mind that within the helmet, he was wearing a padded cap with laces coming out of it, and the laces would be extracted through holes in the side of the helmet, as you can see here, and that would immobilize the head inside the helmet. So in order to see out, he would have to lean forward, look out of the sights, but that was also very dangerous because what that meant was that your opponent's lance could penetrate your helmet. There were many very nasty accidents that way. So right at the last moment, just that split second before the point of impact, they would rear up in their saddles so they were not exposing the sights to their opponent. Well, for most art historians, it is really the 16th century that represents the greatest century in the development of arms and armor. It was during that century that the finest achievements of the armorer in both the design and the decoration of armor were achieved. These new heights of technical and aesthetic sophistication were realized largely as a result of the lavish patronage of princes and nobles whose extravagant tastes employed the talents of many of the most imposing names of the era. So names like Leonardo da Vinci, Hans Holbein, Albrecht Dürer, and Benvenuto Cellini, for example, are found quite matter-of-factly among those names of designers and manufacturers of high-quality armor. And in fact, this drawing I'm showing you here is by Albrecht Dürer. I show you here two armors for the foot tournament made about 1590 by the celebrated Milanese armorer Pompeo della Chiesa. Pompeo's clients included some of the most celebrated noblemen of the day, the two Spanish kings, Philip II and III, Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma and Piacenza, and Vincenzo I Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua. He is also known to have maintained a large workshop in Milan's Sforza Castle. Ostentation was of paramount importance for public spectacles such as tournaments, parades, or pageants. Most wealthy patrons afforded the additional expense of embellishing their armors. The etched and gilded decoration of this style of armor features vertical bands of strap work enclosing cartouches, which in turn contain allegorical figures, classical warriors, and also trophies. The decoration represents Pompeo's classic style of armor decoration, one which is found in over 40 surviving suits today. These and other decorative patterns were normally recorded in pattern books from which the prospective client made his selections. Well, both of those armors that I just showed you were designed specifically for the foot tournament, a separate event from the equestrian jousts and highly favored among Renaissance aristocrats throughout Europe. Increasingly, these friendly combats on foot evolved their own rules of engagement, as well as armor configuration. As they were commonly fought over a barrier which separated the combatants and gave protection to their legs, a half armor, such as the examples I just showed you, provided sufficient protection. The original owners of these suits would have worn them with colorful puffed and slashed breeches and hose, perhaps in the manner of the Spanish king, Philip II, seen here in a portrait by Titian. The use of colorful accessories, such as large ostrich feather plumes and red velvet picadilles between the steel plates, would have added for additional sartorial splendor. Such expressions of virtuosity on the part of the armorer and the armor decorator, usually two separate individuals, appealed to the individuality of Renaissance princes who enjoyed the means to pay for this costly armor. There evolved at this time a stock vocabulary of ornamental details and motifs that came to be used for the decoration of arms and armor, with an ever-increasing sense of extravagance. This ornamental vocabulary ultimately derived from or reflected other branches of the Renaissance decorative arts, chiefly goldsmith work, enameling, and ceramic decoration, and also to a significant degree, printmaking. The most important source of decoration on which Renaissance artists drew were called grotesques, so called because they were found in Roman ruins below ground in what were originally thought to be grottos. These fanciful decorations consisted of interwoven human, animal, and plant forms. The Renaissance adaptation of grotesque ornament was recorded in prints, from which it was disseminated throughout Europe. These designs were readily studied via the print medium in pattern books, usually published for the use of goldsmiths, by arms decorators and their clients. From the early 16th century onward, pattern books supplied fashionable ornamentation, which could either be copied by arms decorators or which served as a basis for evolving their own comparative compositions. This obsession by princely clients for mannered ostentation eventually resulted in armors and weapons designed for aesthetic and ideological purposes rather than practical functionality. Frequently, the function of armor was entirely forgotten as the medieval knightly class was being gradually transformed into courtiers, their armor evolving into spectacular male jewelry. An essential part of this panoply was the trimmings of plumes and colorful fabrics that were attached to armor to be used in parades and pageants. The elaborate armor crafted during the second half of the 16th century with its lavishly decorated plates no longer presented the smooth, glancing surface against which a lance or sword could be used. That had been the original function of armor. And weapons likewise were treated with the same ostentation as signifiers of status and wealth. Patronage, as must now be obvious, was the essential component in fostering the development of armor technology and artistic style. In England, the royal workshops at Greenwich, established by King Henry VIII in 1515, were staffed by armorers from Germany and Flanders. They were responsible for some of the most beautiful armors ever made. The Greenwich Armory made armor primarily for the king and those privileged individuals who obtained royal warrants. Their roster reads like a list of the great 16th century noblemen at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. Lord Pembroke, Lord Worcester, Sir Christopher Hatton, and George Clifford, the Earl of Cumberland. The Earl of Cumberland's suit is seen here on the left. It is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This splendid armor was made about 1585 for George Clifford, who was the third Earl of Cumberland. In homage to Queen Elizabeth, the decoration includes royal badges, Tudor roses, and fleur-de-lis, and the Queen's monogram is interlaced into the strapwork within gilt bands. I show you on the right this dashing portrait of Clifford, painted by Nicholas Hilliard in 1590, wearing armor beneath his tunic. In that same year, Clifford was made champion of the Queen. He won fame and reward as one of the great Elizabethan gentleman pirates who preyed on the Spanish treasure fleets. In the Cleveland collection is one of the most famous Hilliard portrait miniatures, that of Sir Anthony Mildmay, seen on your left. It provides a wealth of documentation about Greenwich armor. Anthony Mildmay was the son of England's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is apparently portrayed here in his field tent in the process of dressing in armor, probably for the tournament. He wears trunk hose and a peascod doublet. On the ground are strewn leg elements from what is clearly a luxurious Greenwich-made suit. Behind on the table to his right is his right gauntlet, plumed helmet, and a holstered wheel-lock pistol. Mildmay's left hand grasps the hilt of an elegant rapier. The sitters who commissioned this very expensive form of portraiture were noted for their wealth, ostentation, and concern with their personal image. The tradition of making armor would gradually survive into the middle of the 17th century, when it would gradually lose its function in the encroaching modern world. With the advancing sophistication of firearms, armor gradually became obsolete. but it continued to be used in pageants, parades, and court festivities, often reaching outrageous levels of Baroque sophistication. By the end of the 17th century, only a few regiments of heavy cavalry still wore armor, and among those, armor had just been reduced to a breastplate without a back. By the mid-17th century, armor was still to be seen in official portraits of monarchs who were eager to present a warlike image while still clinging to the romantic and heroic age of chivalry. Armor still symbolized rank and authority. These symbols tended to endure even though the original reasons for their existence had disappeared. King Charles II of England, shown here in this portrait by Philippe de Champagne, was the last British monarch to own a complete suit of armor. At the time of this portrait, 1653, Charles was in exile in France, awaiting the restoration of his throne. Here he is shown wearing a French cuirassier's armor made of blued and burnished steel. The armor, I think, was very probably given or lent to Charles by his French cousin, Louis XIV, expressly for this portrait. This painting, I think, serves as a suitable postscript to our subject, since it was during Charles's reign that the post of Master of the Armories in London was abolished. Yet there is one other royal portrait in the Cleveland Museum's collections that better serves my purpose. It is that of King George III of England, painted by the American artist Benjamin West. It was painted in 1783, demonstrating the irresistible and iconic character of armor for royal clients long after the actual age of armor. In an age that long ago abandoned the wearing of armor on the battlefield, the English king who lost the American colonies wears full armor in his portrait. Among his accoutrements are a sword with an elaborate pommel and a commander's baton. On his breastplate is a star bearing the insignia of the Order of the Knights of the Garter. So even at the end of the 18th century, monarchs and nobles continued to be portrayed with the full panoply of war and leadership. This potent symbolism of rank and entitlement, as conveyed by armor, extended back to classical times. This technology of art was an important component in the material culture of the European West. Thank you very much.
Still have 3 minutes.